hospital just in case. Sorry, this recap is for me as much as you.
More for you, maybe?
I've had the results from the scan, and I think they told you this, but there is something there that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Well, we can't tell what that is from the scan, but it's pretty big, 6 centimeters long.
6 centimeters? I mean, how big's a testicle?
They vary. Your other one is less than 6 centimeters long.
So the thing inside my testicle is bigger than my testicle, and my testicle's a TARDIS.
There's lots of things that it might be, but you must be aware that it could be...
Cancer?
Yes.
When I saw you before, you said it probably wasn't cancer, but now you can't even say the word cancer.
Well,
No, Doc, it's cool. You did everything right. If this does turn out to be...
that.
Cancer. If it's cancer, then I'm going to be grateful to you for getting me seen so quickly. None of this is your fault.
And it might not be cancer.
I knew you could say it.
But what happens now is that I'll be handing you over to the hospital. They'll do you a full body scan and then most probably take a biopsy so that they can determine what the mass is.
And if it is cancer?
Orchidectomy is a possibility, which is...
Yeah, I can guess what that is. It sounds like something nice. I'm guessing that my orchid's being plucked.
But my colleagues will be in touch to take you through all that. In the meantime, if you have any concerns or questions, do just give me a ring.
I will do, Doctor. Thanks very much. Seriously, no, thanks. You've been brilliant.
You've been so nice about this. You've made me feel a lot better.
It's the main thing.
Goodbye.
Everything okay? Was that the doctor?
Yeah.
Oh no, are you crying?
No, not really.
Oh, darling, you are.
It's not. I'm not really crying. Just water's just spontaneously started cascading out of my eyes. I'm not crying, so it's just falling out on its own. It's weird.
What did he say?
He sounded nervous. His voice was shaking. He couldn't even say the word, Chloe.
Which word?
The word.
The C word.
I don't think it would have been appropriate for him to say the C word.
I meant cancer.
Yeah.
You'd think cancer would be the unsayable C word, wouldn't you? Given how amazing and beautiful and life-giving the thing that is the actual C word is, and how awful cancer is.
Cancer is definitely a C word.
But have you got cancer?
Maybe. Maybe not. There's more tests needed.
Okay, well that's not necessarily so bad.
No, I was just listening to Don and you playing and thinking of my mate Phil and how he left his little boy behind. And I thought this might be it.
No.
In a few months, I might not be even here anymore. That little laughing boy and that little pooping girl will never even know me.
You're not going anywhere.
They're so young, they won't even remember me. And I just thought how unfair that was on them, sure, but mainly on me. For all the work I've put in, those tears weren't even for the kids, or it was only to begin with. I was crying for myself. And what a self-indulgent idiot.
I think it's okay to be self-indulgent right now.
Maybe it's best for me to die before they have a chance to have memories of me. Maybe it's kinder for them to never know who I am, to think whoever comes along next is their dad.
All right, yes, maybe this is too self-indulgent after all.
I was thinking of you, moving on, meeting someone else, probably some Hollywood superstar. Kids would call him dad, and he'd have a really cool moustache and cowboy boots. He'd be in here helping himself to my whiskey, which I bought for me, not for him.
No, he wouldn't just be helping himself to the whiskey.
Yeah, I prefer to focus on the whiskey. Well, bad luck to him, because I'm going to drink all of that whiskey right now. He's not getting free whiskey just because I'm dead.
You're not going to die. If you dare die, I can promise you I will kill you.
So we'll be injecting iodine into your bloodstream. It won't do you any harm. I have to warn you, it might give you the sensation that you've wet yourself.
But you won't have wet yourself.
It'll just feel like it.
Why do you need the iodine in there?
You just find it funny to make people feel like they've wet themselves. Nice prank.
Well, I'm going to prank you back by actually wetting myself.
Touche.
The iodine just helps show up the blood vessels on the scan,
Once you're in the scanner, just do whatever the voice tells you.
even if the voice tells you to kill the president. You have to do it.
Okay.
My colleague is making a reference to The Manchurian Candidate, a film that I repeatedly tell him most people won't have seen.
Yeah, I haven't.
The voice will tell you when to breathe in and breathe out.
Is it okay if when I go into this machine, I pretend that I'm in Total Recall?
That's a much better film reference for this situation. And I can't guarantee that this won't change your... Mine's on Mars.
As long as the girl with 3 breasts is there, then I'm happy. My microwave.
We make a lot of things. My spin dryer, for
We
example.
good coffee, we do nice croissants, and even did a bacon and quail's egg donut back in the day. And then my wife and I took about a year to explore farming and really look into it and confront ourselves with the realities of what we were looking at with the dairy that we were getting and the meat. We were asking butchers and farmers at markets, where do your lambs get slaughtered and so on. And it took a year, but eventually we got to the point where we were like, we need to stop eating all of this stuff. And slowly we were cutting out things. And then another 9 months later, I was making a ham and cheese croissant in the cafe in the morning and felt like I was laying slices of my cat's on the croissant and thought, I really got to stop this, because what's the difference? And so then 6 months later we went vegan in the cafe after a good campaign to convert our customers.
Yeah, well, how did you bring the customers along with you?
We had a little booklet saying this is why we're doing it, and each page was a little bit about each industry and why we were cutting out eggs and milk. And a lot of conversations in a very short space of time before they jumped on the train, because we were under a train station, so I sort of got quite good at trying to get the point across in a very quick and non-judgmental, non-confrontational way, and leave them with some like seeds to grow in them and have a think about it.
Metaphorical seeds.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Help me out with the terminology here, Gavin. We used to talk about veganism as opposed to vegetarianism, but now we talk about things being plant-based. Is plant-based?
And there's no clear-cut definition of it. I think the vegan movement, and particularly the sometimes antagonistic side of it, can put people off veganism, which is just stop using as much as you can animal products or causing the least harm to animals. So plant-based is a softer term. It's like the modern version of it.
And Rachel, how about you? I mean, has your diet become a little bit more plant-based over the last few years as this become more prominent as an idea?
Not at all, to be honest with you. I'm quite comfortable eating meats. I'm very careful as best I can about selecting as much local produce as I can, so supporting heavily my local butcher. I obviously buy from the supermarkets as well, but I look for the red tractor mark, which shows that it's high quality, or also the RSPCA farm assured quality produce. So I haven't changed my diet at all, to be honest. I have tried not that long ago some plant-based food. It did nothing at all for me, to be honest, but I completely accept that others, want to try this and take pleasure from eating it, but it wasn't for me.
Full disclosure, last night I made Jamie Oliver's veggie chili, but from a completely non-political perspective, just because it's very tasty and very easy for a non-cook like me. Right, okay, we've got lots to talk about in this hour. It's going to be absolutely fascinating, but Animal Rebellion's actions first caused a big splash this summer when they went into a fancy department store and poured milk all over the floor in the food section. That led to people online saying they were wasting milk and causing havoc and ruining the lives of normal, hardworking people. But where did Animal Rebellion and their tactics come from? There is a clue in the name. They're an offshoot of the group Extinction Rebellion. Graham Hayes is head of sociology and policy at the University of Aston, and he studies how environmental social movements grow and work.
Animal Rebellion was set up in 2019, and they first made a series of actions during Extinction Rebellion's second period of rebellion. They're a relatively small group. They are fairly light on the ground, they're fairly fast. They're looking for an immediate transition to plant-based systems, but of course, even with the best will in the world, if that was going to happen, it would take time to happen. So they're really about trying to create a media event to try to gain attention and to push the issue up the media agenda.
And this rebellion tag, is that becoming a sort of brand name? How's that working?
Well, I think Extinction Rebellion has changed the game a little bit in this, and one of the things about Extinction Rebellion is that it's very decentralized. We've seen a lot of other organizations develop in the wake of Extinction Rebellion. Animal Rebellion is one, but we also got to think about things like Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil and the tire extinguishers.
When you mentioned the tire extinguishers, they're the people who go around letting down the tires of SUVs in wealthy areas.
Yeah, that's right. And so we can see this as kind of pop-up organisations which may come onto the scene and last for 2-3 years. And their idea is not to last forever. It's not to still be here in 15 years' time, for instance. It's in order to create an issue and to drive that up the policy agenda.
You say it's decentralized, but is there a bit of a kind of rebel alliance, not to sound too Star Warsy?
Yes, I think there is. Look, they're decentralized, but these are all linked. I think we have to see them as being part of a wider network, which are sharing ideas about how to go about producing change. And clearly, if you're a small movement, if you don't have the power, for instance, of the industrial labour movement, what is it that you do in order to attract that attention, in order to get politicians and the press interested? And one of those is using your bodies in creative ways. And those can be obstructing the road, those can be sit-ins, those can be, I think we've seen Animal Rebellion drilling into the tyres of Muller distribution lorries. And therefore there's all sorts of relatively simple, relatively strict.
One sec. Something went wrong. Please try again.
In the 1950s, and we'd go back to the US Civil Rights Movement, which created a kind of a toolkit for obstruction, for various forms of disobedience. And the environmental movement, which developed after 1968, really relied on a lot of these tactics.
And talk to me about this division between people who are called fluffies and people who are called spikies.
This is a type of terminology which is used. Fluffies tend to be those who are very legalistic and see themselves first and foremost as citizens operating within the law. So when Greenpeace formed, it was very much concerned with bearing witness, with not intervening, with the idea that you go to the site of, say, nuclear testing and observing it to show that the world is watching, is looking the state in the eye, is speaking truth to power. And truth is very, very important to that. The idea of knowledge is really, really key here. Now, on the other side of this, you've got what we might call the spikies. So it's relatively small scale, soft forms of sabotage, breaking machinery, construction equipment, sometimes logging. And this has got a history which is associated with groups such as the First, for instance, of the Earth Liberation Front, and is not about acting openly or publicly, but it's about being effective, taking direct action to stop environmentally harmful things from happening at source.
So are Animal Rebellion fluffies or spikies then? I'm not sure which one they are.
There's a little bit of both. I would suggest they're probably more fluffy than they are spiky, but nonetheless, different groups undertake action in different ways. So Extinction Rebellion would tell you in advance what they're going to do. They're trying to get as many people involved, and there's a basic idea of just sitting down in the road to do things. So property damage isn't really part of that toolkit. But as we've seen with Animal Rebellion, there is a willingness to undertake action at night. There is a willingness to undertake forms of property damage, such as burning tyres. But in the end, we've also seen Animal Rebellion, for instance, outside Parliament, openly acting and being arrested and therefore going to court. So there's a little bit of both. There's just slightly blurred lines there. But in the end, they're probably more fluffy than spiky.
Thank you to Graham Hayes. So Gavin, what's your view on what Animal Rebellion have been doing over the summer?
So I think they're part of a bigger movement and they're part of a bigger message. I think every social or environmental movement that's trying to make change in the world is going to have elements of people that are going to not be able to just sit down and wait for the politicians to change things or for the society to see what they're seeing. So I think there's always got to be a place for them. I wouldn't join them. I've done a little bit of activism myself, but nothing where I've damaged property. But it's part of every movement, I think.
Have you been on a bit of a journey in terms of what your activism is? And the last stop was having the chats in the cafe.
No, that was early on. That was my first bit of activism. We made the cafe go vegan before I did any activism because I just sort of trusted that this was the right thing to do. And I'd seen and read up a lot about it. But it was after that I went on my first. It was actually my first thing was a cheese festival at Borough Market. We went and just tried to engage with people who were walking past about the dairy industry and what we'd learnt about it. I've hung a banner outside the art. I tried to hang a banner outside the art factory near where I live in Aylesbury. Ended up putting it on the canal, Regent's Canal in London. About
I think this
Day.
makes you very fluffy, doesn't it?
I think so. I'm not I wouldn't.
Would you ever be tempted to get spikier?
I wouldn't slash tyres. No, not my bag.
Okay, Rachel, I mean, I saw a tweet the other day that compared the animal rebellion people to the suffragettes, people who were controversial at the start but were doing the right thing. Do you think they're actually doing the right thing by just getting us to talk about this?
Well, no, I mean, like what was said there now, they're a small group and they're desperate for media attention. And whilst they might have got the attention of the media, they've lost the attention of the general public by undertaking acts of violence and, basically thuggery and vandalism. I mean, Gavin, obviously a business owner himself, as he said, he wouldn't go around slashing tyres. It's totally unacceptable to disrupt somebody's business in that manner when their business is to just deliver the milk. And the property damage that was referred to in that clip that we listened to, this is criminal. This is a criminal offence. And whether you're a fluffy or a spiky within animal rebellion, you should not be conducting yourselves in that manner. And when it was mentioned that it was soft forms of sabotage, breaking machinery, this is actually criminal damage. And by undertaking these events, these showcase events, where they think that because they're being filmed and it's on the news that actually they're making a difference, they're not. They're turning people off. People are not engaging with them. All they see is the disruption they're facing, the disruption they're causing, the wastage of food by pouring it out over shop floors, and then defacing historical monuments. That does not win you the argument. If you want to talk about veganism, then go out and talk about it and practice it. But by undertaking these acts of vandalism, I'm afraid it just switches the general public off.
Rachel, I mean, farmers have been known to tip milk down the drain as a bit of a protest.
No, farmers were forced to tip milk down the drain when the milk quotas came in. There was nowhere else to send it because when the quotas came in, they based your quota on what you were milking 2 years previously. We were part of that. We didn't tip milk down the drain, but we ended up with a surplus of livestock. We were breeding our own livestock for replacement, which is what I'd need to go into a bit more detail, but farmers wouldn't intentionally tip milk down the drain. They were forced to because of the milk quotas.
I'm maybe thinking of French and Belgian farmers outside the European Parliament. And Gavin, isn't there a risk though that for this cause, which you care about the same things as animal rebellion, you would use different tactics, but I mean, I've seen tweets where people say, right, I'm going to stuff them, I'm going to have a steak tonight. Is there a danger that this is actually counterproductive?
I suppose time will tell. It's not. Again, I wouldn't look at just the one thing that they're doing or the series of things that they've done in the last few weeks and say 2 weeks later, has it worked or not? It's getting me on the show with Rachel. We're talking about it in the middle of the day on Friday. So I think it's part of the journey. It took me a year to, after watching the first animal having its throat slit or whatever, like horrible stuff I saw, and I keep watching sometimes, but not as much as I used to. Eventually your bucket of knowledge about animal agriculture fills up and spills over, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to go vegan now.
But I just wonder, are there tactics and techniques that you're more or less comfortable with, like pouring the milk on the floor, like 4 pints on the floor of a very posh department store, versus, and we heard the quite vivid sound effect at the start of the program of drilling into the tires of the lorries. Would you be happy with one and not the other? Or
I think there's, as long as people aren't getting hurt, I think there's a place for all kinds of activism.
And Animal Rebellion said that they use strictly non-violent direct action, and they're absolutely committed to peaceful action. And they say that every day they send a letter to number 10 Downing Street to call for dialogue so that they could bring their disruption, as they call it, to an end. Right, now, and people throw around a lot of claims on social media about how the dairy industry works. Some of them have already been into that. There's one video on YouTube called Dairy is Scary that's got over 6 million views.
When that baby cow is born, it's pretty much immediately taken away from its mother and locked in a crate. Because if it stayed around long, it would drink her milk. And that shit's for us. And you see, a mother cow's bond with her young is very strong and affectionate. And she sometimes cries out for days in search of her baby. But nobody gives a shit.
Time to call on Charlotte Smith, the very well-spoken presenter of Radio 4's Farming Today, to tell us how dairy farms actually work.
So the average UK dairy farm has about 140 cows. When they reach about 2.5 years old, they get pregnant, and after the calf is born, it's separated from the cow after a day or two. It might be longer, it really depends on the farm. And then the cow goes into the milking herd for the next 9 or 10 months. On average, they produce about 8,000 litres a year. Now, what happens to the calf depends on its sex. Females are kept to go into the milking herd, and the vast majority of males are reared now for the food chain.
Oh, so it's not true that male calves kind of get killed at birth?
That used to be the case, particularly when things were very tight many years ago. I think it changed probably about a decade ago. Retailers helped set up schemes which saw the bobby calves, as they're called, reared and go into the food chain for burgers and things like that. Also, many more farms are using artificial insemination and sexed semen, so that reduces the number of male calves. I did ask the National Farmers Union about this, and they told me that 95% of male calves will now be reared for beef or rosé veal, and the industry is committed to eliminating culling calves, they said, by next year.
And why are the calves and the mothers separated so quickly?
That's partly they stay so that they can get the colostrum, and then they're separated because farmers think that's the. So there's the same with women. The first milk that you give has the antibodies and stuff like that in it. So once they've had that, then they're separated, and farmers see that as the fairest way to do it. And obviously it means that when their milk comes in, that goes to us. So for a vegan, it is fundamentally wrong to separate a calf and a cow. And they see the whole way that dairy industries across the world are run as wrong. Whereas many vegetarians and many people who eat anything and everything just don't have a problem with that. There are some farms which do it slightly differently. There aren't very many of them here in the UK because it's quite niche, but that's called a calf at foot dairy, and that's where you keep the calf and the cow together, and then they are separated for a short amount of time so that the calf doesn't take all the milk and the cow is milked, and then they go back together again. But obviously the milk from in that system is much, much more expensive.
And talking about the economics of this, is there a way that farmers could, I don't know, take less milk from the cows, kind of treat them less intensively, but still be able to make a decent living?
I think farmers would say they don't treat them intensively to get the milk in the first place. They would point out that they've used genetics over the years to breed cows which produce more, and then they also now give them high protein diets, again to produce more, and also to make sure the milk is what they want, either for liquid milk that we would have in tea, or for cheese, for instance, which needs different proteins and fats. While the number of dairy cows has fallen over the years, the amount they produce is up, and it's worth noting actually that the number of dairy farms has fallen. The smaller ones just aren't economic, so they've gone and farms have got bigger. Margins in dairy farming are very thin. They're not making much of a profit now, actually, even though the milk price is really high. It's 48 or 50 pence a litre that farmers are being paid. For context, in 2016, it was about 19 pence a litre. There are people who do it slightly differently. There's the calf at foot dairies that I've mentioned. Some farms milk just once a day, for instance, and they generally then tend to bottle the milk themselves and sell it in vending machines, either as raw milk or they pasteurise it themselves. Other people, for instance, make their own ice cream or kefir or whatever it might be, and that means that they keep more of the value that they've added. They make more money from the raw product.
Now, when you go online and start researching this, very quickly you come across some quite distressing videos. There's a quite famous one on YouTube called Dairy is Scary, and Panorama did an episode this year which saw some undercover filming of cows being kicked and hit with spades. What do we know about animals being mistreated or abused?
Well, it's illegal for a start. I asked DEFRA just to check what all the rules were, and they sent me pages and pages of Animal Welfare Act. They've also got an action plan on animal welfare. And also there are retailers inspect farms as well as other industry bodies. Farmers say you have to like animals to work with them every day. You have to treat them right to get the best results. But there are, I guess, always going to be people who are not doing that. But generally, the farming industry will say it's really rare.
And what has the rise of oat milk and almond milk and soy milk and all the other milks done to the traditional dairy industry, do you reckon?
Yeah, surprisingly, actually, the statistics say it hasn't had that much of an impact. So 99.3% of households have purchased a real dairy product, as the industry would put it, in the past month. That's dairy industry figures. The Vegan Society report in July this year said that in a survey they found 8% of people in the UK are cutting back on dairy or eggs. And there has been a fall in sales of milk. Now, the dairy industry thinks that's
techniques then to enhance the well-being of that dairy cow. So I think there's pros and cons. I like to see this, I'd love to see sort of smaller herds sort of re-emerging, but it's just not cost effective. I don't think I'd want to go back milking to be sort of having to be there twice a day. Wherever we went as kids, we had to be back by 4 o'clock for milking. So the farmer is really, really committed. And like Gavin said, yes, it was our business, but it was our livelihood, but it was our way of life. And we were very fortunate to have to work hard for that. We had to work hard for it, but we were very fortunate to be able to live that life.
I mean, it's fascinating to hear about. I'm just going to bring it back to Animal Rebellion now, because I think it would be worth spending a bit of time working out where they came from. Sorry, we've actually already done that, haven't we? So what we need to do is talk about actually what they're trying to do here, and one of their big messages is about sustainability and the environmental impact of dairy milk versus alternatives. So we thought we'd check that out with Rosie Green, who's a professor in sustainability, nutrition and health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she's got the data to help us to try and make sense of some of those claims. Rosie, just give us a very simple idea about how researchers such as yourself go about calculating the environmental impact of different kinds of milks.
Well, there are a few slightly different ways of doing this, but probably the most popularly used method is a method that's called life cycle assessment. And essentially what that does is it accounts for the greenhouse gas emissions produced and the resources used and sometimes the amount of pollution produced all the way along the stages of production of all the different foods. So, for example, that could include the emissions that are produced by changing land from natural cover to farmland. It could include things like the CO2 produced by farm machinery. It's the food for the livestock, the methane produced by the livestock themselves, and then it can go all the way along to the food processing, the packaging and the transport. And all of those are added up to produce a number which estimates the emissions or the resources used for that whole food in its production.
And to what extent is there a sort of agreed methodology that everyone can sort of get behind?
I think life cycle assessment, or LCA as it's often called, is quite well agreed upon. There are other slightly different ways of measuring things, but I think there's a fairly good degree of agreement that that's quite a robust accounting tool to use.
Okay, well, we're now going to try and do something that's quite tricky on radio, because actually you want to just see a table or a spreadsheet, but do the simple comparison between cow's milk, soya, almond and oat milks for us.
Okay, so we know that for dairy milk there are some significant environmental impacts. It's burps in particular. People often think that it's more farts, but it tends to be more burps from cows. Because cows are ruminants, they produce a lot of methane, and that is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so the animals themselves are really contributing to global warming, and also that, you know, can contribute to deforestation in the Amazon for livestock feed. It uses quite a lot of water to feed the livestock and keep their environments clean, and it also uses quite a lot of land. So all of that adds up to emissions of about 3 kilograms per litre for dairy milk. And to give you some rough comparisons for other types of milk, they would be around 1 kilo a litre, and sometimes a little bit less. So almond milk is probably the lowest greenhouse gas emissions, that's about 0.7 kilos per litre. And then oat milk would be about 0.9, and soy milk's around 1 kilo. So dairy milk is producing around 3 times the emissions per litre compared to plant milks. And then also, if you want to factor in other dairy products such as cheese, those emissions would be higher again because it takes more milk to produce a kilo of cheese.
Okay, so that's one factor that we can look at there. Is there another impact or factor that we should take into account that maybe we don't notice enough?
People do talk about deforestation being associated with soy milk in particular, and clearly soybeans are responsible for quite a lot of deforestation in the Amazon. However, about 75% of the soybeans that are being grown in the Amazon are actually going to animal feed rather than for human consumption. So actually it's more of a problem for dairy milk than it is for soy milk. Most of the soybeans that are grown for human consumption are grown in Europe. So almond milk, it uses very little land and has quite low greenhouse gas emissions, but it does use a lot of water to grow the almonds. And that could be really poor for sustainability, particularly if those almonds are being grown in areas that are prone to drought, which tends to be a problem in California where they do grow a lot of almonds. And so it depends what criteria you're talking about, how damaging a particular type of milk could be. We know from our research that plant milks are around 50% more expensive than dairy milk on average at the moment, and that's definitely going to be a factor for people that might prevent them from switching away from dairy.
And when people say to you, what is the best thing that I should have with my porridge or my cereal in the morning, what do you say?
Well, I would say that oat milk is quite a sustainable alternative all round. It tends to have quite low environmental impacts across the board. Oats can be quite easily grown in the UK. That does mean that you're having oat on oat if you're having oat milk on your porridge, but I've done that and it's quite nice.
A recipe idea as well, thank you very much. And what do you make about the argument about removing livestock from the food system entirely?
This is a slightly difficult one, and I wouldn't say that there's a scientific consensus on that. I've seen it very persuasively argued both ways. From my perspective, I think it's difficult to imagine a world completely without livestock, partly because ruminant animals in particular, so cows and goats and sheep, they can digest food that isn't suitable for human consumption, and then they can convert it into a form that we
want in schemes. So our farmers are much more than producing the food that we eat. They're also huge environmentalists and conservationists, and that will not happen unless they are farming livestock alongside.
Okay, right. Well, we've talked about some of the facts and some of the data and heard some of the arguments. There's also this sort of visceral attachment, though, that some people have to milk in the UK, which got us wondering, where does that feeling actually come from? Peter Atkins is an emeritus professor of geography at Durham University and who's done a lot of research on the history of milk in the UK.
Milk at the beginning of the 20th century was regarded as being a kind of medicine and was dispensed in small amounts to children who were thought to be malnourished in one way or another. In the 1920s, there was a test on various school children to see whether they actually benefited in terms of gaining weight. Here we're talking about children who were underweight because of malnutrition in one way or another. And it was thought at that time, although actually since then we've found that the statistical methods they used weren't perfect by any means. But anyway, people were convinced that milk was a very good source of food for growing children. And this coincided, coincidentally, with a movement to increase milk sales by the milk industry. And this was also a period when milk was being overproduced. In fact, something like 3/4 of the farmers in the country were producing milk to a greater or lesser extent. The National Farmers Union, being one of the most successful of all lobbying groups in the history of this country, thought, well, in that case, We need to lobby the government to provide a government subsidy to spread out school milk as far as we possibly can. The problem was that a lot of dairy produce was being imported from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, and there were some members of the Conservative Party who were very much against this for political reasons.
Was there a politician in that period who was really driving this?
This was Walter Elliott, who was the Minister of Agriculture, yes.
Hey sir, what is the scheme?
Well, it's a scheme by which the government with the Milk Marketing Board are combining to get school children.
In 1933, this is the crucial date when the government decided to make it into their policy. They took it over from the National Milk Publicity Council and they subsidised it.
Why did the government do this, Mr. Ellis?
I'll tell you, first and foremost, milk is good for you. It's good for everybody, but especially good for children. It makes them strong and tall.
How much was it about weighing up what was good for the children and what was good for the farmers?
I think the way I would sum that up is that it was mainly about the farmers because there was a supply side issue. There was a glut of milk which the farmers wanted to shift. So they were very happy to persuade the government through the National Farmers Union to partly subsidise this new big scheme of milk in schools. So if you want to put that in one sentence, it would be that the milk in schools scheme was fattening the farmers as much as, if not more than, fattening the children.
What happens when we get to the Second World War?
Yes, a very important change. The Ministry of Food took over this policy in 1941, and in cahoots with the Department of Education, they tried to spread it out to all children. In fact, Winston Churchill probably was behind this as Prime Minister by then.
Let me say, there's no finer investment for any community than putting milk into babies. Healthy citizens are the greatest asset any country can have.
And in 1946, all charges to parents were abolished. And after that, it became a kind of universal thing, really. For my generation, the baby boomers, we all had milk in school out of these 1/3 pint bottles. I can still remember the smell of the milk as it went off.
And what was this doing to the nation's attitude to milk?
I think it made it extremely popular. One of the original motives of the farming industry was to train consumers to have a product which they wouldn't necessarily have been familiar with because it would have been too expensive in the early days. But with the subsidy, it reached a far greater audience. And the peak of milk consumption in this country was the 1950s and 1960s. And you'll be familiar with the withdrawal of school milk in 1971, Thatcher milk snatcher.
Now most parents can afford to provide their own children with milk or to give them money to buy milk.
The Labour Party actually withdrew milk for secondary schools. Then Mrs. Thatcher, possibly against her political judgment, I don't know. Obviously she was encouraged by Ted Heath, who was the Prime Minister at that time, to reduce costs. So her view was that it should be withdrawn to children between 7 and 11. But in her memoirs, she says that it maximised the amount of political damage and minimised the amount of political gain for her.
Milk at home isn't often available, especially in families where the income is very low.
Well, it's really essential because I can't afford to give them the milk at home, and if they didn't get it at school, then they just wouldn't have it at all, and their health would lack, very badly.
And then after that, some schools, particularly private schools, kept on with school milk, but the consumption of milk fell by about a half. I'm talking about the general population now, not school milk. Between 1971 and the present day, it's fallen by about 50%. So if you believe the idea that you train your consumers and they keep on with the consumption throughout their lives, then that suggests that the withdrawal of milk was a bad thing for the dairy industry.
Thank you to Peter Atkins, and the National Farmers Union told us they continue to support school milk schemes and that the scientific and medical communities agree that milk provides significant nutritional benefit to both adults and children. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left with Gavin and Rachel before our time is up. Gavin, do you think that kind of history and that emotional attachment to milk makes it harder to get people to switch to alternatives?
Yeah, I think it's a staple of most people's lives in the Western world and all over the world. So yeah, it's definitely a hard thing to get away from. Maybe less so now, as I think someone mentioned earlier about just plain milk is something that people don't use so much, but all of the other parts of our culture that food plays a part in, cheese and so on. Yeah, so it's definitely a hard thing to remove from your world. But I don't necessarily think that the vegan options are, like, the vegan cheesemakers have got a lot less time to have done what they're doing than dairy cheesemakers. So I don't think they're there yet. But there's lots of other things that taste really good that you can have instead of cheese or drink instead of milk.
Rachel, what did you make about that quote from Peter Atkins there when he said that the school milk scheme was more about fattening farmers than fattening children, or at least as much about fattening them as the children?
Yeah, I don't think the farmers go fattened very well on that line. But look, milk is not fattening, okay? We get fat because of our diet. So gaining weight occurs when we take in more energy and calories than we use up through our daily activities. So milk is not fattening, but it is obviously full of nutrition. It's naturally rich in protein and provides 7 essential vitamins, including the vitamin B12, which is not naturally present in the vegan diet. And 31% of your daily calcium can come from just 1 200ml glass of semi-skimmed milk. Now, going back to the days, I was a 70s kid, so I remember even though we had plenty of milk at home, and all we had to do was walk out and dip the tank and transfer that into the kitchen jug, which is a task that my sister and I undertook daily. And we had, absolutely bang fresh milk. You couldn't get it any fresher, but we still enjoyed peeling back that foil top in school and having that glass of milk. It was just delicious. And when the chap said he can remember it going off, I can never remember the milk in school going off. All I can remember is that fresh, crisp taste. And the line, milk is medicine. Milk, dairy is good for you, and you mustn't let that sort of yes, there is a historical connectivity, but people generally, as you've already said, it's a staple of most people's lives, and they accept milk for what it is.
But Rachel, are you worried that it's kind of disappearing from people's? It's not becoming a staple anymore?
I'm not at all worried about that, because we certainly don't see that. And in the shops who sell milk, they certainly don't see that. I mean, we're more than likely to walk in the shop and they run out of milk, rather than them having too much and they're selling it to you at a discount price because it's gone off, out of date. I'm not at all worried about the future of the milk industry. What these protests are doing in London and different places, the slashing of tyres, the thuggery, the vandalism, is putting people off the cause. And we put 20 years ago to yesterday, nearly 500,000 people in the streets of London, March for the Liberty and Livelihood, March for the Countryside Alliance, with no vandalism, no thuggery. It was a wonderful experience. I wasn't working for the Alliance then, I was part of the march. And I think if you're going to carry on with this vandalism approach, then you're going to put people off your cause. You want to do something good for your cause, then talk about it as we've done today, and champion it through verbal and Gavin, dialogue.
Yeah, and Gavin, very quickly, does anyone in this shop mention Animal Rebellion when they come in for their...
No, we don't actually promote ourselves as a vegan cafe.
Okay.
There's not many words about it in the shop. We just let people have great food and drink. And
fair enough. Well, and that's where we're going to leave our great conversation this week. Thank you to my guides, Rachel Evans and Gavin Winterwell, and to all our guests. You can get in touch online, use the hashtag BBC Antisocial. And this is the last in our first series of Antisocial, but you can find our back catalogue on BBC Sounds, and you can catch me every weekday on Newscast. We'll be back again soon.
Antisocial is presented by Adam Fleming. The producers were Simon Mabin and Lucy Proctor. Let's have a look at the weather forecast then this Friday lunchtime. And Ben Rich is with us. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Tom. Thank you. Good afternoon. For much of the UK, we've got brighter but rather cool and fresh weather working its way down from the north. Some good spells of sunshine, a scattering of showers. But the exception to that is across the southeast corner of England, where we have extensive cloud and some outbreaks of rain. In fact, a weather front that has become very slow moving and will drag its heels. The rain across some southeastern parts will continue, perhaps for the next 24 hours. So across southeast England, first of all, we can expect cloud and outbreaks of rain. Some of the rain will be heavy as we go through the rest of the afternoon, particularly across parts of Kent and Sussex. For eastern England, we will see cloud tending to break up from the north. It's quite cloudy at the moment. We should see a bit more sunshine developing. Still some rain though plaguing the coasts of Suffolk and Essex. For the rest of England, southwest England, the Midlands, northern England, and also for Wales, It's an afternoon of sunny spells and scattered showers. There shouldn't be too many showers, but they're most likely around some coasts of West Wales and the far southwest of England. And then for Northern Ireland and for Scotland, it is sunshine and showers here, but a few more showers here. The showers are fairly frequent, but there will still be places that avoid them and stay dry. Not too windy out there. We are developing something of a northerly breeze, and it does feel quite cool. Scotland and Northern Ireland 13 to 16 degrees, England and Wales highs between 17 and 20 degrees. Now through this evening and tonight, across the southeast of England and parts of East Anglia, we will continue to see cloud and some outbreaks of rain, but all other parts of the UK will see lengthy clear spells, 1 or 2 showers, most frequent across eastern Scotland and northeast England, and a rather chilly night, particularly in the north. Parts of Scotland will see temperatures dropping close to freezing. Tomorrow, southeast England will continue to see outbreaks of rain for a time. Elsewhere, sunny spells and just 1 or 2 showers. For Sunday, the best of the sunshine in the south, more cloud further north, some rain in northwest Scotland.
On BBC Radio 4.
We've got raspberry jam, we've got smoked salmon because I'm fancy and I asked for it.
Andy Oliver hosts a selection of special guests.
I feel honoured to be in your presence talking about food.
Who share stories and the occasional confession about their one favourite dish.
Are we being honest with each other?
We are being honest with each other.
I love cold lasagna.
One Dish with Andy Oliver.
It's all about why you love that one dish, the one that you could eat over and over again without ever getting tired of it.
Available now on BBC Sounds.
And Le Magique.
On 92 to 95 FM, 198 longwave on BBC Sounds and digital radio. This is BBC Radio 4.
Hello and welcome to The World at One with me, Johnny Diamond. From vicious cycle to virtuous circle, the new Chancellor gives the once derided magic money tree a good old shake.
We promised to prioritise growth, Mr. Speaker. We promised a new approach for a new era. We promised to release the enormous potential of this country. Our growth plan has delivered all those promises and more.
Tax cuts and new spending alongside deregulation so Britain can build. Labour says it's an admission of 12 years of failure.
Not a plan for growth, a plan to reward the already wealthy. A return to the trickle-down of the past. Back to the future, not a brave new era.
We'll have expert analysis and reaction to one of the biggest shake-ups to British economic policy for decades. Referendums on whether to join Russia have begun in 4 occupied areas of Ukraine. We'll bring you the latest. And the author, Dame Hilary Mantel, best known for Booker Award-winning novels Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Bodies, has died.
When we remember, as psychologists so often tell us, we don't reproduce the past, we create it.
We will reflect on her literary legacy. The BBC News is read by Charles Carroll.
The Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has announced a series of tax cuts in a massive shake-up of the UK's finances. Income tax and the stamp duty on home purchases will be cut, and planned rises in business taxes have been scrapped. Mr Kwarteng said that the country was approaching a new era focused on growth. Paul Johnson from the think tank the Institute for Fiscal Studies told the BBC it was the biggest package of tax cuts in 50 years, and a gamble.
It was quite extraordinary. It's like having an entirely new government. This was the biggest tax cutting event since 1972. It's not very many. It's half a century since we've seen tax cuts announced on this scale.
Our economics correspondent, Darshini David, has the details of what was in the Chancellor's mini-budget.
The average worker will gain at least £500 per year from today's measures, which include a 1 penny cut in the base rate of income tax on top of the volte-face on the rise in national insurance. Homebuyers will not face stamp duty unless they're paying over £250,000. A planned hike in corporation tax is going, as is the 45% rate of income tax for top earners. While all will gain, the measures are targeted towards the better off. With some tax changes happening soon, economists say they will help any recession be shorter and less painful, especially once the help for energy bills is added. But some academics claim such cuts aimed at the wealthier fail to boost long-term growth. They warn the government may have to borrow over £200 billion this year to fund its plans. There are also changes to the planning system and other reforms, alongside business tax changes to encourage work and innovation. The Chancellor is taking a huge gamble. Similar attempts by the Conservative Chancellor Anthony Barber in 1972 left inflation soaring.
The changes to stamp duty will not apply in Scotland or in Wales because their devolved governments use a different tax on property purchases. Several of the Chancellor's measures will affect people in Scotland, including the retention of the corporate tax rate and the national insurance reversal. But the basic rate of income tax in Scotland will remain at 21% and the top rate at 46%. Labour said that after more than a decade of Conservative government, the Prime Minister and Chancellor were like two gamblers on a losing run. The Liberal Democrats have called the mini-budget a disaster. From Westminster, here's our political correspondent, Helen Catt.
The announcements made by Kwasi Kwarteng were not only vast in scale, but mark a significant change in political direction. The government's entire focus, he said, was on making Britain more globally competitive. He described it as a new era, to derision from the opposition benches. Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves said Mr Kwarteng had comprehensively demolished the Tories' economic record over the last 12 years and accused him of setting out a budget without figures, a menu without prices. The SNP accused the government of right-wing Thatcher cosplaying. Concern that an official independent forecast had not been published alongside the statement was also raised by the senior Conservative MP Mel Stride, who ran Rishi Sunak's leadership campaign. On the Conservative benches, there is some nervousness about the government's strategy, with one former minister telling the BBC they thought it was either brilliant or bonkers, and time would tell which.
The pound has fallen by nearly 2% against the dollar as financial markets react to the government's budget announcement. At midday, sterling was at $1.10. The pound has also fallen by more than 1% against the euro to €1.12. The cost of servicing the UK's debt has also risen this morning, with yields on the UK's 10-year bond up 7%. Russian officials are staging referendums in 4 occupied regions of Ukraine on whether they should become part of the Russian Federation. Western countries have condemned the votes, taking place in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, as a step towards the annexation of Ukrainian territory. From Kiev, our correspondent Hugo Bashega reports.
In these so-called referendums, there's only one expected result, the one that Russia wants. Ukraine has dismissed this vote as illegal, saying it's Moscow's response to recent defeats on the battlefield. Western countries also don't recognize the legitimacy of the process and see it as a land grab attempt by the Kremlin. This could lead to an escalation in the war. The occupied areas where voting is happening represent 15% of Ukraine's territory. Kyiv says its counteroffensive continues. This morning, President Putin's spokesman gave a sign of what is likely to come. By Ukraine to reclaim territory in the east would be seen as an attack on Russia.
The Booker Prize winning, aged 70. She was best known for a trilogy of historical novels charting the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell in Tudor England, which began with Wolf Hall. Her publisher, HarperCollins, said she had died
in April 2023, 1 year early. That means a tax cut for over 31 million people in just a few months' time. This means that we will have one of the most competitive and pro-growth income tax systems in the world.
These are hugely expensive measures. There wasn't anything more than the vaguest nod towards balancing the books at some point in some measure. The tax cuts cake and the spending cake will be quick to eat and slow to pay for, paid for by generations of taxpayers to come. The old rules on borrowing have been torn up. Again, new rules, said the Chancellor, would follow. But he made clear that today he was presenting the House and the country with a new economic order of priorities.
Now we need to focus on growth, not just how we tax and spend. We won't apologise for managing the economy in a way that increases prosperity and living standards. Our entire focus is on making Britain more globally competitive, not losing out to our competitors abroad. The Prime Minister promised that we would be a tax-cutting government. Today, we have cut stamp duty, we have allowed businesses to keep more of their own money to invest, to innovate and to grow. We have cut income tax and national insurance for millions of workers. We are securing our place in a fiercely competitive global economy with lower rates of corporation tax and lower rates of personal tax.
Well, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, was confronted with the challenge of a Conservative Party and government shaking the magic money tree that it had so scorned the Labour Party for believing in just a few years ago. Never, she said, had a government borrowed so much and explained so little. The statement, she said, was one last throw of the dice.
You need a credible plan. And the truth is that this government does not have one. The Prime Minister and Chancellor are like two desperate gamblers in a casino chasing a losing run. The argument peddled by the Chancellor today isn't a great new idea or a game changer, as the Minister said, as much as he'd like us to think so. What this plan adds up to is to keep corporation tax where it is today and take national insurance contributions back to where they were in March. Some new plan.
Well, we will have further reaction from the Labour Party later in the programme. But first, let's turn to two of our in-house experts. Darshini David is our business correspondent. Vicky Young is our deputy political editor. Darshini, let me start with you. The most important economic measures there, perhaps not the sort of shiniest and brightest things, but the most important things in your eyes?
Well, this is a scale budget no one really, very few people who are working today will have seen in their working lives. And in fact, they haven't seen this kind of plan in their working lives either, because you can take your pick of any one of these measures. When you look at things like the cuts to income tax rates, national insurance, stamp duty, those are all geared towards boosting short-term growth, making sure that pain of that recession, which the Bank of England says we are already in, isn't as long and as painful and as prolonged. But it also has a more lasting aim here as well. And this is the really interesting bit, because these cuts are unashamedly aimed towards the better off. And there's a reason for that, because the Chancellor, we heard him talking about this there, he thinks this will create the incentives to innovate, to create jobs and boost our longer term potential. And it's the less sort of glamorous stuff, the planning reforms, the supply side measures, as he termed them, that are also geared towards boosting that longer term potential. But we haven't seen this kind of approach for decades. Historians say this doesn't tend to work, boosting the cuts for the wealthiest, hoping that'll benefit society as a whole. As a result, you've got the financial markets incredibly jittery. I've been covering budgets for over 2 decades now. I've never seen them fall in this kind of way when you're looking at the foreign exchange markets. And that's because they are concerned this is a huge gamble with our prosperity. We are looking perhaps at borrowing this year alone of over £200 billion.
Vicky Young in Westminster, Darshini uses the phrase longer term. It's not a very long term that the government has in office before it faces the electorate, is it? Does that create some nerves amongst its supporters in the Commons?
I think actually it explains what's going on today to some extent. You've got Liz Truss coming in as Prime Minister and a new Chancellor as well, and they know that they've only got 2 years until the next general election. And if you look at political history, by then the Tories would have been in power for 14 years. They will be looking at that and thinking, look, you know, there's quite a high chance that they're not going to end up with the same majority that Boris Johnson won, and even worse for them, they might be out of power. And they are going for it. One MP said they're going for broke, and then said rather nervously, well, I hope not literally. But the fact that they are bringing in huge amounts of borrowing at a time when borrowing is getting more expensive, that's one side of it, not seen as particularly conservative. And then the other side, which you've alluded to there, is what they're using that money for. There are plenty of Conservatives saying, actually, if you use it to invest in skills and education, but no, they're using it for tax cuts. Now, yes, of course, some of them will be looked at as that they're helping the wealthy. That is no doubt the case. But it's across the board. It's the 19p on income tax, basic rate of income tax as well. So the government would argue they're trying to help everybody. A huge amount of the money is going to keep down those energy bills, something they say they just simply had to do. But it's turning things on its head. This is not a new government coming in. This is a government of the same colour as the previous two, but seems incredibly different. If you think of those days of austerity, George Osborne justifying every pound really and how you're going to pay for it, absolutely no suggestion of that. Kwasi Kwarteng simply saying we'll get debt down in the medium term with no details.
Darshini, you mentioned, I think in the news bulletin, this was your phrase, huge gamble. You mentioned that barber boom of the early 70s, which led to rocketing inflation. Presumably this time, the difference in the government's eyes is that monetary policy, that is interest rates, is in the hand of the Bank of England, and they say, well, it's up to you to control inflation. We may well be seeing those two bodies, the Treasury and the Bank, just going their different ways.
Indeed, and economists I'm already talking to are saying, look, what's on the table now is bigger than we expected, and that means that inflation is likely to be higher than we expected, interest rates stay higher for longer. But look, Kwasi Kwarteng is not the first Chancellor by any means to say, I'd like the economy to grow by 2.5% per year. Guess what? Most in recent years have been disappointed. So you could argue we do need to see something new, something revolutionary. But as we were hearing there from Vicky, these kind of measures take years to actually work. And one Treasury veteran I heard from said, look, 20, 30 years, not 2 years ahead of an election. That's when you tend to see these type of results. The idea that tax cuts pay for themselves, same person said to me, that's one for the birds.
Darshini, Vicky, thank you very much indeed. That's Darshini David and Vicky Young. We will turn now to Carl Emerson, Deputy Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And one is tempted always to turn to the IFS and say, does it add up? You've already pretty much declared it does not add up. How much of a problem is it?
Well, it's a problem if we don't get much stronger growth. Certainly the kind of growth rates that we think are likely, that many people think are likely, would mean that even once the very expensive support for energy bills have expired, the government's likely to be borrowing something like £110 billion a year, we think, in the medium run. That level of borrowing would mean that debt would continue to rise as a share of GDP, and at some point tax rises or spending cuts would have to follow. So it wouldn't, to make this add up, you wouldn't be able to do that. Now, there's a chance that we will get better growth. It could be that the government gets lucky and the growth comes along. It could be that we see over the next year or so lots of really growth-friendly reforms that help bring about stronger growth. But at the moment where we're standing, it looks like these tax cuts won't be sustainable, and that other tax rises or that spending cuts will be needed to pay for them.
We often break tax changes down into a sort of a phraseology, don't we? Progressive and regressive. Progressive generally meaning helping the poorer, regressive meaning helping the richer. Where do these current tax cuts fall?
Well, tax cuts clearly these are direct tax cuts largely, and clearly they only benefit people who are actually paying direct taxes. So in terms of the national insurance cut, you have to be earning over about £12,500 a year, and the more you earn over about that amount, the more you will gain from that tax cut. The income tax cut to the additional rate will help a relatively small number, something like 1%, maybe 2% of adults who are the very highest earners will benefit from that. So it's quite clearly the case that these tax cuts will benefit those further up the income distribution by a lot more than those further down the income distribution.
And do we have a consensus? Is there any kind of economic consensus behind what is now the backbone of Conservative economic policy, that growth will pay the bills?
Well, these tax cuts alone will not deliver sufficient increases in growth to make them self-financing. I think that's pretty clear. When you cut things like national insurance contributions, you can expect some people to work a little bit more, some people to enter work as a result, but most people will work just as many hours in the same job for the same salary. So these tax cuts alone will not pay for themselves. As I say, it's possible that growth will turn out to be much higher than we expect. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. That could happen through luck. It could happen through a whole set of reforms to things like planning laws, migration policy, education policy, training policy, and a real concerted effort in all of those areas, which would be very, very welcome. But it's yet to be seen that we will actually do that.
Carl Emerson, thank you very much for coming on The World at One. Well, let's look at some of the growth makers, some of the private businesses who've been waiting to find out their future. The Confederation of British Industry has largely welcomed the plans, labelling them a turning point for our economy. Small business owners like Anna Hamill, the founder of Belfast-based card and gift retailer And Hope Designs, believes consumers will have more to spend.
The reversal in national insurance and then the freeze on energy bills as well, I think will relieve some pressure. that was mounting on people thinking, oh, I have this bill to pay, I have that bill to pay, this is coming out of my account. So hopefully people will feel a bit more comfortable spending, and that will help businesses and the economy.
Ron Emerson was the founding chairman of the British Business Bank. He's now chairman of Bank North, a new bank with 40 employees set up to support small and medium-sized businesses.
In my view, there's a slight whiff of panic about this. It looks like throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and hoping some of it sticks. I applaud what they're doing and what they're trying to do, and clearly there needs to be something dramatic to get the economy going. But I think with the overhang of doubt around the cost of living for the next year or so, I'm not sure a lot of these initiatives will have a huge effect. I hope they do. The piece that I'm interested in is the regional tax breaks, not just because it links to what our mission is, but the fact is, and the Chancellor mentioned, that there's a need for structural change, and he's absolutely right. We still have the most distorted economy in the Western world, 25% of GDP coming out of London alone. And there's been a lot of talk about levelling up. But what isn't clear in this budget or in government policy yet is an understanding that you cannot level up these regions without scaling up the SMEs, the small, mid-sized enterprises, because that's the bulk of these regional economies. And you can't scale up these businesses without patient capital, equity and debt. And that's a fundamental problem right now if they're serious about that scaling.
That was Ron Emerson, the chairman of Bank North. So Rocco Forte is chairman of Rocco Forte Hotels and has donated to the Conservative Party. Good afternoon, Sir Rocco.
Good afternoon to you.
What do you make of this package? Sir Rocco?
Hello.
Hello, Sir Rocco.
Yes.
I just asked you what you made of the package.
Well, I think it's terrific. I mean, I've never seen a government hit the ground running as fast as this one in coming to power, and the things that it has said it's going to deliver, it's delivering very quickly. This is going to be a huge boost to the economy, and it's only the beginning, I think, of what this government intends to do. Obviously, a lot of this has to be coupled with regulation, and I think that we'll see that coming in the future, and the full advantages of Brexit being taken. We have a situation where there's monetary tightening going on to quite a significant degree, and therefore an element of fiscal loosening to balance this is a good thing. Everybody carries on about the debt. We have the lowest level of debt as a percentage of GDP of any of the main G7 countries. We're at 80-odd%. And that's, although it's higher than we'd like to be, it's still relatively low. Japan is at 250%, Italy's at 150, France is at 100. So this sort of huge concern and worry about the level of the debt is completely overdone. I'm very, very encouraged by this. It's a tax which will help it's a budget which will help enterprise. It will allow individuals to reap the rewards of their efforts and hard work. It's removed national insurance, which has been talked about, of course, was a tax on jobs as well as it's a tax on businesses as well as individuals. At a time when a lot of businesses are struggling.
Some of the very poorest workers in your chain of hotels, the chambermaids and the cleaners, for example, will get the very least from these tax cuts. Some of your best off British guests will get the most. Is that the right direction? Is that the right direction?
To quite a significant degree. Are you still hearing me?
I'm still hearing you, Sir Rocco.
Hello?
Hello, Sir Rocco, I can hear you.
Hello?
Oh, we may have lost Sir Rocco, or he has lost us, unfortunately, at the moment. Oh, Sir Rocco, I was just putting the point to you that the very poorest workers in your hotels will receive the least, the best off guests will receive the most from taxes. Is that the right direction for the country to go?
I mean, it's not an issue. Our top tax rate is far too high. We had after the last Lawson budgets, we had the top rate of tax reduced to 40%, and it was at that level for a long, long time. It was then put up to 50% by Gordon Brown and then reduced by George Osborne to 45. People who are actually the engines of the economy are the ones that should benefit the most. And it's completely ridiculous that we should have one of the highest tax rates in Europe, individual tax rates in Europe, at the 45% level. So I think it's completely the right thing to do.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Sir Rocco, we'll have to leave it there. Forgive me. I'm very grateful for you giving us some of your time to come on the programme. Well, the Prime Minister's plans were roundly criticised during the campaign for the Conservative Party leadership by her rival, Rishi Sunak. His backer, one of his backers, MP John Glenn, left his Treasury post when the new government came in. Where does he put the Chancellor's package of measures on the economic Richter scale?
Well, it is an enormous intervention. The Prime Minister, while she was campaigning for the leadership, made clear that she was going to do things differently, and her Chancellor have been very true to that. And there's a whole range of interventions here in personal taxation, stimulus for investment, for what they see as the growth that we haven't had in the economy.
A very good chunk of this, if not all of it, is going on the never, isn't it? With the hope that at some point economic growth will help pay for it.
Yes.
Do you buy that?
Well, I think that the therapeutic effect of these interventions on growth is yet to be quantified or any timeline put against it. But it is a bold set of interventions, and it's very probable that it will have an effect on investment decisions. And it will have a stimulus effect. The quantification of that and the timing of the effect of that and how enduring it is, set against the interest rates rising and the cost of borrowing at an uncertain trajectory, is the key issue that we need to resolve in the coming weeks and months. And that's obviously something that the Chancellor will be very focused on.
Conservative MP John Glenn. Lisa Nandy is the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. She joins me from Westminster. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
A stimulus effect. It is exactly what the economy needs as it slips into recession, isn't it? A bit of boost and a bit of confidence.
Well, they've hit the ground running, but they've hit the ground running in the wrong direction. It's not just that politically, it is extraordinary to think that this is the moment to hand a tax cut worth 55,000 to people earning over $1 million when people are struggling with their not just energy costs but housing, food, all of the essentials. It's that this has been tried before. As Rachel Reeves said in the chamber today, it's the end of levelling up and the return of trickle down. These sorts of approaches where you try and pile more and more wealth to fewer and fewer people in the hope that they'll continue to outstrip everybody else and do well. It was tried by David Cameron and George Osborne. It's been tried over and over again by the Conservative Party over the last 12 years, and it doesn't work. It has not produced growth, and we're stuck in this high tax, low growth spiral. The only way out of it in the end is to get money back into working people's pockets so they spend locally and that they sustain thriving economies.
If you come back into power in a couple of years' time, presuming that's when the next general election is, would you reverse these two tax cuts, the income tax cuts?
Well, we're going to do better than that. We're going to oppose them right now. And I think looking at the look on many Tory MPs' faces on the back benches in the chamber just a few moments ago, there are a number of Conservative MPs who believe that these changes are politically unsustainable. I wouldn't like to be one of the new red wall Conservative MPs having to go back to my constituency and justify not just a large transfer of wealth to the most affluent people in the country at the expense of the poorest, but a large transfer of wealth as well away from our regions to London and the South East, where most higher rate taxpayers are. I think that the government is going to come in for a lot of pressure on this over the next few weeks, and as we go into the hardest winter that I think most of us can imagine.
Conservatives won a lot of elections cutting taxes, in particular base rate taxes. Got a lot of support. Are you not worried that actually it's quite a popular move?
Well, the trouble is it's a regressive move. Far more help is going to people who are doing well than to people who are struggling, and there are a lot of people in this country who are struggling right now. So I think people will see very clearly the unfairness of it. But we're not against cutting taxes. It's just a question of what taxes, who benefits and who pays. And the problem with the government's announcements are not only have they refused to tax the big oil and gas producers' profits, so they're loading the cost onto those same low and middle income families who are already struggling, but it's also that they're cutting corporation tax, for example, but why not business rates for many high street companies, small companies that make up the bulk of the economy in most of our regions and nations and are really struggling at the moment? That's what we would prioritise, and that's where we would start.
You are, as I don't need to tell you, the Levelling Up Secretary. You take a very keen interest in this as well because of your constituency with it, don't you? You must be delighted about the talk of new investment zones with special low tax incentives, a way of kick-starting bits of the country that have not been in the spotlight for so long.
Well, we've already got them, actually. George Osborne announced them in 2011. It was part of his so-called Northern Powerhouse, although every single promise that was then made was broken. But what did come out of that was enterprise zones where taxes were cut for businesses who invested in them. The trouble with this version is that it's not targeted on areas of the country that are in economic decline. The government has reached out to some very prosperous parts of the country, in Cambridge and in parts of Norwich. They've been looking to try and put more investment and more money in areas that are already doing well, because they think that that's where they'll get more bang for their buck and meet their headline 2.5% aggregate growth figure. That not only won't deliver for many deprived parts of the country, it could actually make it worse, because if businesses in these zones aren't paying taxes, other businesses in other parts of the country are going to have to take the strain.
Are you concerned that you have been, for want of a better word, outflanked on spending, especially over energy, where the government has come up with a very, very generous policy to try and help people out?
Not at all. We've been pushing the government for a year now to come forward with help for people with their energy bills this winter, and I am delighted that finally we've got some help coming to families who are already struggling to pay those costs before even it gets particularly cold. The problem is, though, who pays, and that cost being loaded on to low and middle income families at a time when people aren't just struggling with energy, they're struggling with housing costs, they're struggling with soaring food prices. That is a real problem. We would have taxed the big oil and gas producers who've made record profits. The government has decided not to do that. This is a deeply regressive package, and it's creating a perfect storm as we go into the winter.
Lisa Nadi, thank you very much for coming on The World at One. Well, Andrew Griffith is the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. When I spoke to him a bit earlier, I put it to him that the government had no mandate for such a radical programme.
What we've done today is announce a plan for growth, and that plan for growth has three components. It's protecting businesses, consumers, households, and thereby giving confidence to the economy. The second thing we've done is cut taxes. That's because of our long-term belief that allowing people to keep more of what they earn gives them the incentive to work hard, to seek employment, and it will produce a more productive economy that means we can pay for the public services that we all value. And then the third thing we've done is to try and unleash the economy, to tackle that issue that we all know, that the road we want built, the houses, perhaps the new energy project is just taking way too long to deliver. So the Chancellor's announced a measure of what they call supply side reforms that will just try and cut through a lot of red tape and allow things that were going to happen, but they're going to happen a lot more quickly. And all of that will mean that we seek to get the economy to grow at a higher rate than it has over the last 20 years, but that's not a rate that it hasn't grown at in the past.
You have not announced a way of paying for these measures. In fact, you've just said you're going to borrow, and at some point you promise fiscal responsibility, balancing the books.
Well, I was just reading the response from the CBI this morning, the Voice of Business, and they said quite rightly that we had no choice to do this. It would have been much more damaging if we hadn't borrowed at this stage to protect businesses and households, much as the government did during COVID, to prevent long-term scarring in the economy and to maintain confidence and mean that we don't tip the economy into a deeper recession than might otherwise be the case.
And your big bet is that growth will pay for this, that this isn't just sloughed off onto the shoulders of future generations, that the economy will grow.
That's 100% right, but it's not. I really resist the idea it's a bet, because there's a set of detailed plans and there'll be more to follow over the coming weeks. But you're absolutely right, we are on the side of growth. We think that the way you get the economy growing is to reward risk takers, those who are creating wealth and prosperity, and then of course taxing the proceeds of that so that we can get high quality public services. That is the strategy that we're laying out today.
We have the opposite of growth right now, don't we? We have recession. When do you think the growth is going to happen that's going to pay the bills?
Well, I'm not going to make economic forecasts. That's not what the government's trying to do here. We're trying to create the environment in which the economy can grow. But by taking the measures we have on energy, we will be reducing the headline rate of inflation by about 5%. And by giving people that confidence, they'll hopefully keep spending. We've taken measures on stamp duty that will allow them to continue to support the housing market if they've got aspirations to be a first-time buyer. And from next April, every household in work will be better off because we're cutting the rate of headline income tax and allowing them to keep more of their own money.
Minister, if it is growth that is going to pay the bills, do not people have the right to know when you think that growth is going to return?
Well, I think the forecast that I or others would make, and the Chancellor's committed to an OBR forecast by the end of this year, so nobody will have long to wait in terms of what the impact will be on the public finances. The most important thing to do is to get on as we have at real pace and lay out the plans.
But this gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? If you can't say when the growth is going to come, you can't say when the bills are going to be paid.
Well, with the best will in the world, if we'd sat here a year ago, we wouldn't have predicted the impact of Putin's war in Ukraine.
Is it 2 years or 5 years, for example?
Well, the job of the government to do, and I think what your listeners will understand, is it's not the job of the government to sit here and lay out forecasts of growth over any particular period of time.
But then you can't pledge fiscal responsibility, can you? If you can't tell us when the growth is going to come that will pay the bills, you can't realistically say you are going to pay those bills.
No, at the heart of these measures is a belief that if you unleash private investment in every part of the United Kingdom, if you improve our international competitiveness, then we will benefit from the fruits of that. The exact laydown month by month, year by year is for other forecasters to make, but that is absolutely the core of what we're doing it, and it's not a uncosted, unbenefited plan. It's a series of detailed measures in the housing market, in relation to childcare, in relation to how we make our financial services more competitive, and how we create investment zones across the United Kingdom so that people see in their street, in their town, the real difference that investment can make to their lives.
How much do you care about the market response, the jump in price of borrowing for the government?
It's not for any individual in the government to comment on the market. The government goes into this in terms of its ability to finance its plans in very good shape. We have the second lowest ratio of debt to GDP of any of the major G7 economies. And let's go back to the fact the reason why the government is increasing borrowing today is to protect households, to make sure that as we go into a difficult winter, that households have the reassurance that their prices are capped, that they know what that impact will be, and small businesses across the country will be heaving a sigh of relief that they know how they're going to be able to balance the books this winter.
You mentioned protecting households. Do you care that the tax policy you have announced does benefit the better off more than it does the poor?
Well, it's an inevitable fact that cutting income tax will benefit those who bear the biggest burden today. But allowing everybody to keep more of what they earn and growing the overall size of the cake so that we can continue to fund high quality public services and over the medium term to pay down our debt is the right balance of measures.
The politics of two particular moves will stand out to people. One is abolishing the top rate of income tax, which affects the best off, and another is saying to people who are on very little universal credit, who are working the equivalent of 15 hours a week, if they don't do more work effectively, you'll try and cut their benefits. It looks like a very odd move for a government that is talking constantly about the impact on households and individuals.
Well, it doesn't benefit anybody if we don't make our economy competitive. You know, the world doesn't owe us a living. There's plenty of other countries and markets out there that would love to have the successful industries that the UK have, whether that's the media, including the BBC, or whether it's our financial services industry. And it's also true that work pays, and that the best way is to get people into work. And we have a record level of number of people who are out of work at the same time as employers are screaming out for the employees they need to grow their businesses. So those two things don't quite reconcile. And if we're able to say to people, look, now's a really good time to go out and look for employment, to see if you can get more hours if you're already working, then I think that's the right thing to do.
Do you acknowledge that there is something of a leap of faith about this, that it is an ideologically driven statement on growth?
Well, there is a belief and a conviction that if you create a competitive market in which people can make the most of their skills and that we can attract investment from other markets around the world, then that is the core to economic growth.
You don't think there's a leap of faith?
But that's a tried and tested policy. That's how economies have grown in the past. That's how many of our competitor economies have grown and evolved.
That was Andrew Griffith, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. We will come back to the government's economic proposals later in the programme. As always, you can contact us world@bbc.co.uk or use the hashtag BBCWATO. Voting is underway in 4 Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine in referendums on whether to join Russia. Russian-backed officials have orchestrated the ballots, which have been denounced as illegitimate by Ukraine and the West. The fear is that a formal annexation could lead to a claim by Russia that its territory, rather than just eastern Ukraine, is coming under attack from Western weapons, which could escalate the war further. This man voted in the Donetsk region earlier today.
I have great hopes for this referendum. I don't know what else to say. It was a pleasure to vote. Of course, Ukraine is spoiling this day for us by yesterday's horrible shelling at Donetsk market. But we put our hope in Russia with all our strength, hearts and minds. We want to return home as quickly as possible. We want Russia to take us under its wing.
Russia enthusiast there. Sarah Rainsford is our Eastern Europe correspondent. Sarah, I understand ballot boxes are going from